Our new Conservatives video on our progress on delivering on the people's priorities, Conservative Party Chairman Greg Hands has proudly tweeted.
Mr. Speaker, I've laid out my priorities for the country. Waiting list down, inflation down, debt down, growth up, and the votes stop, Mr. Speaker.
Hang on to your seats for this one.
Waiting list down.
Well, imagine the shock when the Conservative Party finds out that under this government, a record 7 million people are now waiting for hospital treatment. And thanks to the Health Secretary's refusal to negotiate with junior doctors, wanting to restrict them to a derisory 2%, with inflation running in excess of 10%, tens of thousands of junior doctors in England are now taking part in an unprecedented 4 days of strike action, which could see an estimated 350,000 appointments and operations cancelled.
Today, NHS waiting lists are actually at an all-time high.
Inflation down.
Well, again, imagine the shock when they find out the Conservative government has given us the highest inflation in 40 years. And on that, here's an update from the Chancellor himself, Jeremy Hunt.
Coffee is getting more expensive. A year ago, it would have been around £2.50, but now it's gone up to nearly £3 a cup. And the price of the weekly shop, if you look at food prices, has gone up by about 16%. And for the poorest families, the things they typically buy have gone up by even more. The Bank of England's inflation target is 2%, but currently inflation is about 10%. That means more expensive food, fuel, it means unemployment going up, businesses failing. A pound in your pocket is worth less than it used to be.
Well, that's one hell of an achievement.
Debt down.
Well, they'll fall off their chair when they find out that under the Conservative government, UK debt has risen to its highest level in 60 years.
Growth up.
Seriously? The International Monetary Fund says the UK economy's performance in 2023 will be the worst among the 20 biggest economies known as the G20, which includes sanctions-hit Russia. The simple fact of the matter is 13 years of Conservative government has left us with the highest inflation in 40 years, the highest taxation since the Second World War, the biggest drop in living standards since records began, and average wages falling at their fastest rate for more than 2 decades. And guess who was running the economy for almost 3 of those years?
You were Chancellor until a few weeks ago. UK growth is set to be the worst in the G20 besides Russia. Another study says we will go from 18th to 31st out of 38 OECD countries. Members here see their pound shrinking, probably as fast as they see their high streets closing.
And I'll point this out every day if I have to. All that comes on top of a decade of soaring food banks, poverty, homelessness, falling life expectancy and wage stagnation under successive Conservative governments.
And the votes stop, Mr. Speaker.
Well, let's see how that's going. The number of individuals crossing in small boats has risen sharply from 299 in 2018 to over 45,000 in 2022. By now, even Larry the Cat knows the huge rise in the numbers of dangerous small boat crossings is in large part a direct consequence of the Brexit deal championed by the Prime Minister himself. A recent study by Durham University found the primary factor in the skyrocketing number of small boat crossings is Boris Johnson's oven-ready Brexit deal. According to the report, it was the government's decision to leave the EU without a returns agreement in place which has led to the skyrocketing number of dangerous small boat crossings. Some news channels at least are now catching on.
It's very hard to send people back to safe third countries if you don't have any agreements to do so. Now, once upon a time, when we were in the EU, we had operated under something called the Dublin Regulations, which allowed us to send asylum seekers back, in theory, to the place where they had first arrived and claimed asylum. Those fell away upon Brexit, and we haven't really replaced them. We have half a dozen or so agreements in place.
Here are some of the report's key findings. The primary factor behind small boat crossings is the UK's lack lacking a returns agreement with the EU. The government never assessed the impact of the consequences for leaving the EU without a returns agreement to replace the Dublin regulation and was caught by surprise. The UK did not need to leave this agreement in leaving the EU. Non-EU members have returns agreements with the EU. The lack of a returns agreement fueled an increase in crossings. A key factor is the withdrawal from a returns policy with the EU in 2020. Since 2016, the government has been warned repeatedly about the consequences of leaving the EU without a returns policy in place, including that it would fuel a large increase in irregular migration. It was asked several times to offer an assessment of the consequences, but it declined. The failure to acknowledge its past policy failure has impacted on its ability to fix it. After repeatedly denying the need to make any assessment of its oven-ready deal, the government appears unable to acknowledge that its failure to agree a returns agreement in this deal would have the consequences it has. This is because to address this failing is to recognise its earlier error, which may have political costs. And now Sunak's government wants to use a problem it's created to trample on human rights.
So we believe that our bill is compliant with the ECHR.
Again, by now even Larry the Cat knows Sunak's illegal migration bill is a flagrant breach of the government's obligations under both the Refugee Convention and the European Convention on Human Rights. It says as much on the front page of the bill.
The bill, very unusually, on the cover, says the Home Secretary is unable to make a statement that the provisions of the illegal migration bill are compatible with the Convention rights.
And there's more.
In a letter to Tory MPs, the Home Secretary conveys the legal advice that there is a more than 50% chance the provisions may not be in line with the Convention.
Sunak's bill effectively allows the government to commit human rights abuses without consequences. Remember, human rights are universal. It's not up to this government to pick and choose who does and doesn't deserve them.